There are churches that sing like celestial choirs and yet bleed in silence. There are communities that support missionaries, preachers, and noble causes, but stumble in the simple gesture of loving those around them. This was the case in Philippi. And it is here that the voice of Charles Spurgeon seems to pierce the centuries like a solemn bell, calling attention not to the outward appearance of faith, but to the heart that sustains it. Because according to him, when the flame of communion goes out, the entire spiritual edifice lives only on the warmth of old memories. The church in Philippi was admirable in human eyes, faithful, generous, present when Paul was forgotten, persecuted, and imprisoned. A church that did not turn its back when the apostle was far away, nor close its hand when the gospel demanded sacrifice. But Spurgeon would remind us that true spiritual health is not measured only by what is done outwardly, but by what is cultivated inwardly. And within that church, something was beginning to creak like an invisible beam about to give way. Relationships were becoming unhealthy. Paul perceives this before the fracture becomes public. He writes not as an accuser, but as one who discerns. There are tensions. There are hardened hearts. There are brothers who pray together but no longer walk together. Spurgeon said that division rarely begins with great heresies. It is born from small misalignments of the soul, from untreated affections, from tolerated vanities, from egos that learn to justify themselves in the name of faith. How many churches have crumbled not for lack of doctrine, but for an excess of pride? Euodia and Syntyche were not enemies of the faith. They were co-workers. They served together. They suffered together. But something shifted. The I began to speak louder than the we. And when that happens, what was partnership transforms into silent competition. Spurgeon warned that the devil doesn't need to destroy a church when he only manages to cool the love between the brethren. That's enough. The rest comes on its own. Here arises the troubling question. How could a church so committed to the gospel have lost itself in the realm of emotions? The answer is uncomfortable because it affects us as well. It is possible to love the mission and neglect our brother. It is possible to defend the truth and wound with it. It is possible to serve God and yet demand to be served by men. Spurgeon would call this a Christianity that has not yet descended from the mind to the heart. Paul then prepares the ground for something deeper. He doesn't begin with rules, nor with direct rebukes. He begins by probing the spirit of the community. If there is exhortation in Christ, if there is comfort of love, if there is communion of the Spirit, if the word hangs like a mirror before the church. The problem was not the absence of Christ, but the excessive presence of the self. And where the self reigns, love always pays the price. Spurgeon used to say that the church is not a museum of flawless saints, but a hospital for souls in process. Philippi wasn't dead, it was sick. And all spiritual sickness begins when we stop guarding our hearts. The tension there wasn't accidental, it was revealing. It revealed how much still needed to be learned about humility, renunciation, and true communion. This is only the beginning of the exposed wound. Paul has not yet presented the remedy, but he has already made the diagnosis clear. Something needs to change at the core of the church's soul. And the question that continues to echo, like an unsettling whisper, is simple and dangerous. If the problem was not in the mission, nor in the declared faith, where exactly was it hidden? There are sins that kneel in public, and others that sit discreetly in the church pews. Charles Spurgeon warned that some of the most dangerous enemies of the soul do not shout blasphemies, they whisper justifications. Paul knew this when he wrote to the Philippians. He points out not only visible conflicts, but exposes invisible forces that corrode communities from within. Partisanship, vainglory, and the silent worship of self. Three ancient idols, always disguised as spiritual zeal. Partisanship rarely presents itself as division. It arrives disguised as affinity. Like-minded people draw closer, share pains, build trust. Nothing seems wrong at first, but slowly, the circle closes. Those who don't belong begin to be seen as a threat or a nuisance. What was communion becomes territory. Spurgeon said that when the church becomes a trench, Love has already abandoned the field. How many times do we call this defending principles when, in reality, we are only protecting positions? Vainglory is even more subtle. It doesn't hinder service, it motivates it. People work, help, show up, sacrifice time, but they expect to be seen. They want recognition, influence, applause. When they don't receive it, they become sick inside. Paul calls this by its name without softening it: vainglory. Spurgeon asserted that spiritual pride is more dangerous than worldly pride because it learns to quote verses to justify itself. The heart begins to measure value by the attention received, and not by silent faithfulness. Then comes narcissism, the most widely accepted of modern sins. It doesn't manifest as raw selfishness, but as refined self-importance. The person doesn't say, "I am the center," but acts as if everyone should adjust to their orbit. Conversations revolve around their pains. Decisions must respect their limits. Conflicts always blame the other person. Spurgeon warned that the man who only contemplates himself ends up incapable of contemplating Christ. And where Christ ceases to be seen, love begins to wither. Paul observes this happening in Philippi. Sincere, devout, committed people, but increasingly self-centered. The question that lingers is not theological, it's existential. How did we get here without realizing it? Perhaps because these sins don't break visible rules, they merely displace the throne. Christ remains present in the discourse, but the self begins to govern the decisions. And when this happens, the community enters a strange state. It continues to function, but it no longer pulsates. Spurgeon compared this phenomenon to a flame without oxygen. There is still fire, but it consumes itself. Meetings continue. Ministries remain active, but joy disappears. Small disagreements become battles. Simple words wound like blades. Silences become more eloquent than prayers. No one planned this. No one woke up desiring division. But the unguarded heart always finds a way to its own throne. There's a profound irony here. The people most involved are often the ones who get hurt the most. The more someone invests, the more they expect in return. When that return doesn't come, resentment is born. Spurgeon said that resentment is a memory that refuses to heal. It grows, feeds on comparisons, and begins to reinterpret the past. Where there was once partnership, now there is only competition. Where there was grace, now there is calculation. Paul, however, does not interrupt the letter with accusations. He prepares the reader for something greater. He shows the abyss before presenting the bridge. Because as long as the church insists on resolving conflicts by strengthening the self, nothing will change. The root of the problem is not in external behavior, but in the inner order of the soul. And the question that becomes inevitable, almost disconcerting, begins to echo. If the gospel has not dethroned the self, what kind of gospel are we living? There is a moment when Paul interrupts the diagnosis and shifts the focus of the conversation. He no longer discusses behaviors, conflicts, or proper names. He moves the church's gaze from the human realm to a higher and more dangerous region, the interior of the mind. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. This is not moral advice. It is an ontological call. Charles Spurgeon would say that here Paul is not asking for effort but surrender. He is not demanding technique but transformation. Because changing attitudes is possible through discipline, but changing the mind only happens when something greater occupies the throne of the soul. This call reveals something disconcerting. The central problem of the church was not relational, but mental. People were acting according to the common logic of the world, even when clothed in Christian language. They thought in terms of right, recognition, position, and self-righteousness. Paul, then, proposes a radical break. Another mind, another axis, another center. The mind of Christ is not born of calculation, but of surrender. It does not first ask, what is right for me, but what glorifies God in the other. Spurgeon taught that true spirituality begins when the Christian learns to think contrary to natural instinct. This transition is silent, but profound. Paul doesn't describe Christ yet. He prepares the ground. Before speaking of the cross, he speaks of the mind. Before sacrifice, of inner disposition. This reveals that Christianity doesn't begin with doing, but with seeing. When one sees as Christ sees, one acts as Christ acts. Conflict arises when the mind remains old while language becomes religious. The church in Philippi needed something that no superficial reconciliation could offer. It needed a new center of consciousness. But how does one abandon the logic of the self without losing one's own identity? How does one assume another mind without negating one's own existence? Here arises a paradox that Spurgeon enjoyed exploring. The mind of Christ does not crush the individual, it liberates him. While the ego governs, the soul lives in permanent defense. It needs to prove its worth, justify decisions, protect its territory. The mind of Christ dissolves this silent prison. It does not eliminate the personality, but purifies its motivations. The person ceases to act to assert themselves and begins to act out of love. Not because they have lost strength, but because they have found meaning. This is the difference between forced submission and voluntary humility. Paul, in writing this, knows he is asking for something impossible by human means. No one naturally wakes up wanting to give up their own center. That is why the invitation is not imitate Christ, but have the same attitude. It is about participation, not acting. Spurgeon affirmed that the mind of Christ is not a distant ideal, but a reality implanted by the Spirit. Where Christ dwells, his disposition begins to shape affections, choices, and reactions. The transformation is slow, but inevitable. There is something almost mystical here, in the most biblical sense of the term. Faith ceases to be mere belief and becomes unity. The Christian not only follows Christ, he begins to think from Christ's perspective. This explains why Paul chooses this exact point to change the course of the letter. He knows that no community heals itself simply by resolving conflicts. It heals when the center of the mind is realigned. Without this, all peace will be temporary. All reconciliation will be fragile. But are we truly willing to allow our way of thinking to be challenged and dismantled? The mind of Christ introduces a strange kind of freedom. Freedom from always having to win. Freedom from having to be recognized. Freedom from reacting to every provocation. To the world, this seems like weakness. To Paul, it is spiritual maturity. Spurgeon said that the strongest man is not the one who dominates others, but the one who governs his own heart before God. When this mind begins to operate, something changes in the environment. Relationships cease to be arenas and become paths. This is where Paul's letter becomes dangerous, because it doesn't offer quick solutions, but demands inner death. The self needs to be removed from the center, and that never happens without resistance. The church in Philippi didn't know it yet, but it was about to face the most disconcerting example of all. Paul hadn't yet mentioned the cross, but he had already prepared his heart for it. And the question that remains hanging, almost unsettlingly, is this: if we have to choose between preserving our ego or adopting the mind of Christ, what are we really willing to lose? There is a point in the narrative where reason recedes and astonishment takes over. Paul finally reveals what underpins the entire previous call, the path that Christ chose to tread. Not a symbolic or metaphorical path, but a historical, concrete, and profoundly improbable one. Charles Spurgeon used to say that if the gospel were a human invention, it would never have conceived of a God who descends instead of ascends. All religions build ladders. Christianity speaks of a God who chooses to descend them. And Paul leads the church in Philippi precisely to this abyss of meaning. Christ existed before all things, before time, before matter, before language. Scripture affirms that he subsisted in the form of God, sharing glory, power, and eternity. However, he did not cling to this as a treasure to be defended. This detail has always intrigued theologians and historians. In a world where kings killed to maintain thrones and emperors demanded absolute worship, the eternal Son chose to relinquish his rights. Spurgeon observed that here there is no loss of divinity, but a voluntary renunciation of privileges. Power was not seized, it was surrendered. The text says that he emptied himself. This word has traversed centuries of debate, but its force remains simple and devastating. The creator of the universe chose to limit himself. He who sustains galaxies accepted dependence on a human womb. There are historical records that affirm that in the 1st century, many philosophers mocked this idea. For them, a God who cries, feels hunger, and gets tired was an intolerable contradiction. But it is precisely this contradiction that defines Christianity. The infinite entered the finite without destroying the finite. Christ was not born in a palace. He was born in a common environment, surrounded by anonymity. He was wrapped in simple swaddling clothes and placed in an unlikely place. Spurgeon liked to remind us that the first throne of the King of Kings was a manger, and his first worshippers were unknown shepherds. Nothing there suggested glory in human eyes. Everything pointed to humility. From the beginning, the message was clear. God was not interested in impressing, but in redeeming. Throughout his life, Jesus consistently chose the lowest path. He sat at the table with the rejected, touched those whom no one else touched, and listened to the voiceless. In a rigid culture of hierarchies, he inverted the logic. There are historical accounts that show the disciples' shock when he took on tasks reserved for slaves. Washing feet was not a symbolic gesture. It was a socially humiliating act. Yet he did it without long speeches, only with silent actions. Spurgeon said that there Christ preached a sermon that no words could surpass. The self-emptying didn't stop at service. It progressed to total obedience. Jesus submitted to the Father's will to the most extreme point possible. The cross was not a political accident nor a mere judicial error. It was a conscious choice. Roman documents confirm that crucifixion was reserved for the worst criminals, used as an instrument of public terror. The fact that Christ accepted this fate reveals something that still baffles today. Divine love does not avoid pain when pain is the path to redemption. Spurgeon asserted that at that moment heaven remained silent not out of indifference, but for a purpose. The Son carried what did not belong to him to liberate those who could not liberate themselves. He emptied himself of honor, so that others might be clothed in grace. He humbled himself to the ultimate limit, because there was no other way capable of reaching the human heart. Paul presents this path not as a distant doctrine, but as a mirror. The mind of Christ inevitably leads to the path of Christ. There are no shortcuts. Descent precedes elevation. Emptiness precedes glory. The church in Philippi needed to understand this, not as theory, but as a way of life. And perhaps this is the most disconcerting point of all. If Christ himself chose to descend so low, what kind of height are we still trying to preserve for ourselves? The silence of the cross was not the end of the story. It seemed definitive, heavy, irreversible, but it was only the pause before the most radical reversal ever recorded. Paul leads the narrative to this extreme point, only to then provoke an abrupt shift. Therefore, God also highly exalted him. The phrase breaks through the morning like an unexpected thunderclap. The downward path does not end on the ground. It goes through the ground. Charles Spurgeon said that the resurrection was not merely a return to life, but God's public response to the Son's silent obedience. The Father did not intervene to spare the pain. He intervened to reveal the purpose. Exaltation doesn't stem from self-promotion, but from the enduring faithfulness that persists when there is no applause. Christ didn't rise to claim anything. He didn't write a defense. He didn't summon legions. He didn't negotiate his honor. And that's precisely where the tension grows. Who, in our world, relinquishes rights without demanding immediate compensation? Human logic would expect that if there were glory, it would come as a visible reward, quick recognition, public reparation. But God acts outside our timetable. Exaltation does come, but it comes from above, in God's time, with God's criteria. When Paul states that God has highly exalted him, he points to something unparalleled. It is not a gradual or symbolic elevation. It is an absolute transformation. He who was reduced to utter shame is placed above every name. He who was treated as cursed is declared Lord. He who was judged by men becomes the judge before whom all will appear. The tension intensifies because this exaltation is not merely theological. It is cosmic. Nothing is beyond the reach of this statement. Historical records show that the title Lord was reserved for Roman emperors. Calling them that was a political statement. Paul knows this. By stating that Jesus Christ is Lord, he is not using neutral language. He is directly confronting the powers of his time. And here comes an unexpected twist. The crucified carpenter receives a title that no empire has been able to sustain eternally. The force that seemed weak overcomes the force that seemed invincible. The narrative progresses and the tension grows even more. Paul says that every knee will bow, not just those who believe, not just those who love. Everyone, heaven, earth, and everything under the earth. The text leaves no room for doubt. There are no silent exceptions. There is no eternal resistance. History moves towards an inevitable point of universal recognition. Those who denied, mocked, or ignored will also be there. The exaltation of Christ does not depend on human approval. It imposes itself as the ultimate reality. This moment carries an uncomfortable weight because it reveals that Christ's humility was not weakness, but a divine strategy. The cross was not defeat, it was the path. And this casts a disturbing shadow over our own choices. If God exalts those who humble themselves, what happens to those who build their lives solely on self-preservation? If the Father honors silent obedience, what does he do with the constant pursuit of visibility? Spurgeon used to say that God is in no hurry to justify his servants, because time always ends up revealing the truth. The exaltation of Christ confirms this. It did not come to satisfy immediate expectations, but to establish an eternal standard. Those who follow Christ need to accept that recognition may be delayed, but it will not fail. The danger lies in giving up in silence, thinking that nothing is happening. Paul doesn't allow the reader to breathe easily here. He intensifies the impact by stating that every tongue will confess. It won't be a silent gesture, nor a forced consent. It will be a declaration. The entire universe will verbalize what the cross had already announced in silence. The tension of the narrative reaches its peak because now it's not just about Christ, but about all of us before him. And when everything seems resolved, the question arises that sets the stage for the final outcome. If exaltation belongs to God and not to man, what are we doing when we seek recognition prematurely? If the throne belongs to Christ, where exactly have we been trying to sit while we await glory? We have reached the point where theology ceases to be an idea and becomes a mirror. After the humiliation and exaltation of Christ, Paul offers neither applause nor distant contemplation. He places us before a silent, yet inevitable decision. What will we do with all this? Charles Spurgeon said that truth that does not transform us ends up only informing us, and a faith that does not descend into daily life is nothing more than spiritual ornament. The gospel was not revealed to be admired, but lived. Everything we've seen so far converges on a simple and uncomfortable axis. The center needs to shift. It's not enough to agree with the message. It's necessary to allow it to reorganize affections, choices, and reactions. In relationships, this means abandoning the logic of constant defense and adopting the logic of conscious surrender. At home, perhaps this translates to listening before responding, yielding before winning, forgiving before demanding. At work, it might mean acting with integrity even when no one recognizes it. In church, it might mean serving without a show, loving without immediate reciprocation, and walking alongside difficult people without demanding that they change first. Paul leads us to practical questions that leave no room for escape. Have we clung to our rights to the point of sacrificing reconciliation? Have we used faith as a shield to protect our ego? Have we served only when we are seen, or do we continue when no one notices? Spurgeon reminded us that the true test of humility is not what we do in public, but what we choose in anonymity. The mind of Christ is not revealed in grand speeches, but in small daily decisions that no one applauds. Following this path requires courage, because it involves real losses. You lose control. You lose the need to be right. You lose the illusion of centrality. But it is precisely in this loss that something greater is born. When the ego leaves the throne, peace finds space. When vanity yields, love breathes. When humility reigns, relationships cease to be arenas and become places of healing. This doesn't happen all at once, nor without resistance. It is a continuous process, often silent, almost invisible to human eyes, but profoundly observed by God. There is also a promise that sustains this path. Those who humble themselves are not lost. Those who empty themselves do not disappear. Those who serve are not forgotten. Exaltation is not our responsibility. It belongs to God. Our role is to live in a way that is consistent with the gospel, trusting that the right time never fails. Spurgeon said that God writes long stories, and we only see short chapters. Today's faithfulness may not be rewarded now, but it will never be ignored. The final invitation in this guide is not for perfection, but for willingness. Willingness to think differently, react differently, and love differently. Willingness to allow the mind of Christ to shape our attitudes. Willingness to take concrete steps, even small ones, toward reconciliation, service, and humility. Perhaps the first step is a postponed conversation, a request for forgiveness, a necessary silence, or a decision to serve someone who has never reciprocated. The gospel manifests itself in these simple and profound choices. If this message resonated with you, don't let it die in your thoughts. Reflect on it, apply it, and share your experience. If you wish, write in the comments, even anonymously, how this topic touched your life or your relationships. Like this video so that more people can be reached by this message, and subscribe to the channel to continue receiving content that deepens faith and strengthens the Christian walk. May God guide your steps, transform your relationships, and be glorified in everything.